It is very hard for archaeologists to explain how that was done using purely leverage and mechanical advantage.
Something is carved into the granite bedrock of Aswan, Egypt, that nobody can explain. Not your history teacher, not the Egyptologists who have spent their entire careers studying these quarries, not even the engineers who have tried and failed to replicate it with the exact tools ancient Egyptians supposedly used. Smooth curved scoops, hundreds of them, gouged into stone that ranks between 6 and 7 on the Mohs hardness scale. That means this rock is harder than steel, and yet someone, thousands of years ago, carved into it with a precision so consistent that an artificial intelligence measured the variation at less than 5%. For over a century, archaeologists gave us a neat little story. Workers knelt in trenches and bashed the granite with balls of dolerite, a slightly harder rock. Thousands of blows, day after day, until the stone yielded. It sounded reasonable. Nobody questioned it too deeply. Until now. In 2024, Elon Musk's AI system, Grok, was fed high-resolution, multispectral photographs of these quarry marks. It was told to analyze the patterns without assumptions, without loyalty to any existing theory, and without the career pressures that silence human researchers. What Grok found did not just challenge the textbook explanation, it demolished it. This is the story of what an artificial intelligence uncovered about one of history's greatest unsolved engineering mysteries, and why the proof has been staring us in the face for thousands of years. To understand what Grok discovered, you first need to understand the place where the mystery lives. The Aswan granite quarries stretch along the banks of the Nile in southern Egypt, roughly 500 miles upriver from Cairo. This is where the ancient Egyptians sourced the hardest, most prized building material in their entire civilization. The pink granite pulled from these quarries ended up in the Great Pyramid of Giza, in the temples of Karnak and Luxor, in the towering obelisks that once lined ceremonial avenues, and in the polished sarcophagi that held the remains of pharaohs. Granite is brutally hard. Composed of interlocking crystals of quartz, feldspar, and mica, it registers between 6 and 7 on the Mohs hardness scale. Copper, the primary metal available to dynastic Egyptians, sits at roughly 3.5. Bronze is only slightly better. Trying to cut granite with copper is like carving a diamond with a butter knife. The quarry's most famous feature is the unfinished obelisk, a colossal monolith still attached to the bedrock after an ancient crack forced its abandonment. Had it been completed, it would have stood 42 meters tall and weighed roughly 1,200 tons, one-third larger than any obelisk ever erected. That is heavier than 2 fully loaded 747s stacked together. And it is the walls of the trenches carved around this enormous obelisk and across the broader quarry complex where the scoop marks appear. The marks that defy every conventional explanation. The marks that brought an artificial intelligence to a conclusion no human researcher had dared to formally state. Here is what you will notice if you ever visit the Aswan quarries in person. Across the walls of the extraction trenches, covering granite surfaces adjacent to the obelisk, and scattered throughout the broader quarry complex, there are curved depressions in the stone. Researchers and visitors alike have described them the same way for decades. It looks as though someone scooped the granite out like ice cream. Each scoop is roughly 6 to 8 inches wide and 2 to 4 inches deep. They follow smooth, consistent arcs and overlap slightly, creating a wave-like surface texture that feels polished to the touch. When archaeologist Reginald Engelbach first documented these marks in the 1920s, he compared them to cuts made by a gigantic cheese scoop. That description has stuck because nobody has offered a better one. Here is the critical detail. When modern researchers recreate these marks by pounding granite with dolerite balls, the technique mainstream archaeology insists was used, The results look nothing like the quarry walls. Experimental attempts produce rough, irregular pits with fractured edges and inconsistent depths. A 2023 photogrammetric study confirmed that dolerite pounders remove material far more slowly than previously estimated, and the resulting surface bears little resemblance to the actual quarry marks. The only tool we can confirm the ancient Egyptians possessed cannot produce the marks we can confirm they left behind. That contradiction has been quietly acknowledged for decades, but until Grok's analysis, nobody had systematically quantified how vast the gap really was. When Grok was given thousands of high-resolution images of the Aswan scoop marks, the AI was not told what to look for. It was not given the dolerite pounding theory as a starting framework. It was simply instructed to measure, categorize, and compare the marks against a comprehensive database of cutting and carving methods spanning both ancient and modern techniques. The first result stopped researchers cold. Grok measured the size variation across thousands of individual scoop marks and found it was less than 5%. The width, depth, and curvature of the scoops were nearly identical across vast stretches of quarry wall. That level of uniformity is extraordinary. If you have ever tried any kind of repetitive handwork, hammering, carving, even painting, you know that human output varies. Fatigue sets in. Angles shift. Pressure changes. The idea that workers kneeling in cramped trenches, swinging stone balls overhead, could produce marks with less than 5% variation across hundreds of repetitions does not just strain credulity. It breaks it. The second finding was even more unsettling. The spacing between successive scoop marks varied by less than 3%, and this means the tool, whatever it was being repositioned between cuts with a regularity that implies mechanical guidance, not the natural rhythm of human arms and shoulders. Each scoop followed the same arc radius, as if whatever was making the cut had a fixed pivot point, like the arm of a machine rotating around a central axis. Grok's third finding concerned the angle of approach. Every scoop entered the granite at a consistent angle. Not the varied shifting angles you would expect from different workers in different postures using different-sized rocks in confined spaces. A consistent angle. The kind of consistency that comes from a tool that is mechanically constrained to move along a predetermined path. The AI's overall assessment was unambiguous. The patterns in the Aswan quarry scoop marks were inconsistent with hand tool percussion methods and consistent with mechanically guided cutting, where the position, speed, and pressure of the cutting instrument were controlled by something other than a human hand alone. Precision alone might be explained away by exceptional skill and practice. But Grok identified scoop marks in locations where a human worker physically could not have operated a pounding tool. Some marks continue beneath granite blocks that were never extracted. The cutting motion passed through spaces too confined for a human body. Others appear in tight interior corners with no room for the necessary range of motion, or on near vertical surfaces at heights requiring suspension, while somehow maintaining enough leverage to deliver powerful blows. Engineer Christopher Dunn, author of Advanced Technology in Ancient Egypt, spent years examining these marks and theorized they were produced by something resembling a massive belt sander mounted on a pivoting mechanical arm. Mainstream Egyptology dismissed his proposals as fringe speculation, but Grok's geometric analysis of the tool paths supported the same fundamental conclusion. Whatever made these marks operated with degrees of freedom that do not match the physical constraints of the human body. Scattered across the Aswan quarries are features even more difficult to explain than the scoop marks. Deep, narrow vertical shafts cut straight down into solid granite. These pits plunge to depths of 30 to 50 feet, with widths of only 3 to 4 feet. Their walls are smooth and uniform, displaying the same mysterious scoop marks visible on the trench surfaces above. Think about it. You are at the bottom of a 40-foot shaft barely 3 feet wide. There is almost no room to move, let alone generate force. Dust and rock chips accumulate. The air is stale. Light barely reaches you. And somehow, you are expected to maintain the same smooth, consistent cutting quality visible 30 feet above. The walls of these test pits show no degradation in quality from top to bottom. There is no roughening, no loss of precision, no evidence that the cutting method became less effective as conditions worsened with depth. Whatever technique was used, it worked equally well at the surface and 50 feet underground, in full light and near total darkness. Even stranger, Grok found that some of these shafts curve as they descend, following the natural grain and mineral veins of the granite. This suggests the ancient cutters were somehow responding to the internal structure of the stone, structure that would be invisible from the surface. Modern quarries use ground-penetrating radar and seismic surveys to map subsurface geology before they cut. Ancient Egypt supposedly had nothing of the kind, and yet the pit placement tells a different story. If the macroscopic evidence challenges the traditional narrative, the microscopic evidence detonates it. When researchers supplied Grok with electron microscope images of the granite surfaces inside the scoop marks, the AI detected features that conventional study had overlooked. Faint spiral patterns inside the scoops, consistent with rotational cutting, a drill bit or milling head spinning as it moved through the stone. Not the random fracture patterns of rock-smashing rock. Spirals. At the microscopic level, Grok also identified granite particles at the bottom of the scoops that appeared partially fused, suggesting intense localized heat during cutting. Impact percussion is a cold process. Stone hits stone, generating no heat sufficient to melt granite crystals. But high-speed rotational cutting absolutely would produce that thermal signature. Chemical analysis revealed trace amounts of compounds matching diamond dust and corundum, crystalline aluminum oxide. Both are staples of modern industrial cutting. Both are harder than granite, and both leave distinctive chemical fingerprints when used as abrasives. Grok compared these signatures to its database and identified the closest modern matches: water jet cutting, ultrasonic cutting, and diamond-tipped rotary tools. All produce surface characteristics similar to the Aswan scoops. All are technologies that should not exist in Bronze Age Egypt, but the physical evidence says something functionally similar was in use. Grok's analysis extended beyond the individual marks to the quarry as a whole, and what it found was equally disturbing. When the AI mapped the positions of the deep test pits across the quarry complex, the pits were not randomly distributed. They aligned with underground fault lines, mineral veins, and structural weaknesses in the granite, features that are invisible from the surface but have since been confirmed by modern geological surveys using ground-penetrating radar. The ancient quarry workers somehow knew where the best stone lay, where flaws would appear, and where extraction would be most productive, before they ever broke ground. The overall extraction layout exhibited optimization characteristics. Trenches minimized internal stress in the remaining rock. Cutting patterns avoided stress concentrations that would fracture surrounding stone unpredictably. Extraction routes followed the granite's crystal structure to reduce resistance and waste. Modern quarries achieved this kind of optimization using computer modeling and decades of geological data. At Aswan, someone achieved comparable results thousands of years before either existed. In the southern section of the quarries, Grok analyzed a large depression, traditionally interpreted as an ancient harbor or loading area for transporting finished stones down the Nile. Based on the depression's geometry and volume, the AI proposed a dramatically different interpretation. This cavity was not a harbor. It was the void left behind after extracting a single gargantuan block of granite. Grok estimated that the missing block could have weighed between 3,000 and 5,000 tons. For perspective, the Lateran obelisk in Rome, the largest Egyptian obelisk ever erected, weighs around 455 tons. The heaviest stone in the Great Pyramid is approximately 80 tons. If Grok's estimate is correct, the Aswan quarry workers were attempting to move objects an order of magnitude larger than anything in the known archaeological record. Everything we have discussed so far is troubling enough on its own. But Grok's most controversial finding was about time, specifically the age of the quarry work. In several locations throughout the Aswan quarries, there are prehistoric-style paintings on the granite surfaces. Simple red ochre drawings of birds, boats, and geometric symbols. These paintings are stylistically similar to rock art found across the Sahara and Nile Valley, typically dated to roughly 4,000 to 6,000 years before the Common Era, well before the pharaohs, well before the pyramids, well before what we consider the beginning of Egyptian civilization around 3,100 BCE. Here is the critical observation. Some of these red ochre paintings sit directly on top of the precision scoop marks. The paint fills the grooves. It settles into the curves. This means, unambiguously, that the scoop marks were already there when the paintings were applied. The cutting came first. The prehistoric art came second. If the paintings date to 4000 BCE or earlier, the scoop marks must be older still. This places the most sophisticated granite cutting work at Aswan not during the age of the pharaohs, but in the murky pre-dynastic period, possibly before 4000 BCE, possibly much earlier. The precision cutting that defies Bronze Age technology may not be Bronze Age at all. Grok identified another reinforcing pattern. When the AI compared cutting quality across different quarry areas roughly datable by inscriptions, tool marks, and context, it found an inverse relationship. The oldest work was the most precise. Later work was progressively cruder. Technology was not accumulating, it was declining. In zones confidently attributed to dynastic activity, areas with hieroglyphs, evidence of copper and bronze tools, and historical connections, the cutting is rougher, less uniform, and fully consistent with known ancient capabilities. But in the deeper, older sections, where no dynastic markers exist, the cutting is extraordinary. Too precise, too consistent, too sophisticated for any Bronze Age technology. Grok's conclusion was blunt. The most advanced quarry work at Aswan may not have been performed by the civilization we credit with building the pyramids. It may have been done by whoever came before them. If this evidence is taken seriously, and it should be because it is based on physical measurements anyone can verify, three possibilities emerge. First, lost technology. The dynastic Egyptians possessed cutting methods far more advanced than the copper chisels and dolerite pounders found in tombs and sites. Perhaps these tools were rare, reserved for critical projects, and made from materials that did not survive. The tools are gone, but their handiwork is permanently carved into granite. Second, a predecessor civilization. The most sophisticated quarry work was not done by dynastic Egyptians at all, but by an earlier culture thriving during the wet Sahara period, when North Africa's climate supported far larger and more complex societies. Dynastic Egypt may have inherited the quarries, completing some projects, abandoning others, and gradually losing the original capabilities over centuries. This explains the inverse timeline. The oldest work is the best because it was done by the original builders. Third, a chronological error. Our dating of Egyptian civilization may need revision. What we call the Old Kingdom might be a later, declining phase of a civilization whose true origins and greatest achievements stretch far deeper into the past than current models allow. Each possibility is revolutionary. Each requires rethinking assumptions treated as settled fact, and each is supported by evidence carved permanently into one of the hardest stones on Earth. Why did it take an artificial intelligence to see what has been sitting in plain sight for over a century? The scoop marks were first documented in the 1920s. The test pits have been cataloged for decades. The red ochre paintings were photographed long ago. Engineer Christopher Dunn published his analysis in 1998. Brian Forster has led tours to the site for years. The evidence was never hidden. The granite was speaking. We simply were not prepared to listen. Grok succeeded because an AI carries no career investments, no institutional loyalties, no fear of professional ridicule. It processes thousands of measurements simultaneously, compares them against vast databases, identifies statistical patterns invisible to the human eye, and reports its findings without filtering them through what is considered acceptable to conclude. And the data leads somewhere deeply uncomfortable. Some researchers are proposing that dolerite experiments need redesign, perhaps combinations of pounding, grinding, fire setting, and water-produced results closer to what we see. A 2026 study in NPJ Heritage Science explored the feasibility of using molten sodium carbonate, derived from natron, to crack granite chemically. Ancient Egypt had abundant natron. Perhaps chemistry played a far larger role than anyone imagined. Others suggest the answer may lie in organic-based abrasives or chemical processing methods that enhanced copper and bronze tools beyond what raw metal experiments would predict. And a growing group argues that the Aswan quarries, the Great Pyramid's internal chambers, the Serapeum boxes at Saqqara, and the impossibly precise ancient stone vases are all remnants of a pre-dynastic civilization whose accomplishments were later attributed to pharaohs who never originated them. The granite quarries of Aswan have been hiding their secrets in plain sight for millennia. The scoop marks are real. You can fly to Egypt, walk into the quarry, and touch them yourself. The precision is measurable. The microscopic signatures are documented. The timeline evidence is physically embedded in layers of paint and stone that cannot be rearranged for comfort. Grok AI did not discover a new quarry or unearth a hidden chamber. It analyzed existing evidence without preconceptions, applied quantitative rigor to observations that had been treated as curiosities, and arrived at conclusions the data demanded but human researchers had been reluctant to voice. Ancient Egypt shaped granite using methods we cannot replicate with the tools we assume they possessed. The precision exceeds unguided hand labor. The microscopic evidence points to cutting technologies that belong in a modern factory. The geological knowledge in the quarry layout implies capabilities that should not exist in the ancient world. And the oldest work is the best work, suggesting not the dawn of a civilization, but the twilight of one. The stones have been speaking for 6,000 years. Grok finally translated what they were trying to tell us. The question now is whether we are willing to listen.